Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here at this meeting. I'm going to talk about why anti-capitalists should reject the European Union, but I don't want to start with the question of the European Union. I want to start with a more broader discussion of the political situation we're in. One of the problems for us as socialists, as people who want to transform the world, is that often we live through periods of relative stability, of relative calm, in which it seems like nothing can change. And the thing we have to remember about capitalism is the very dynamism of capitalism, the very speed with which capitalism changes and transforms itself, again and again throws a system into crisis, and again transforms the political system we live under. This is a point that Marx makes in the Communist Manifesto when he says that under capitalism, all that is solid melts into air. And what we're seeing at the moment around the world on a global scale is the institutions, the organizations, the political certainties that have developed over 30 or 40 years beginning to melt into air. We're seeing a very broad transformation of the political situation that we face. And it's creating a world full of both dangers and opportunities. I'll talk about the opportunities first because I tend to be optimistic when I look at the world. The most obvious example, look at what's happening in Algeria at the moment. In Algeria, what you have is a revolutionary process driven by working class people. Something that is supposed to be impossible in the contemporary world of capitalism. A major strike movement, along with demonstrations of working class people on the streets of the Algerian capital and other cities, has driven a president from power. Somewhere else in Africa, in Sudan, you have an even more remarkable revolutionary process unfolding, in which again a series of strikes, of street rebellions, of protests and so on, coordinated by a professional association, a professional body, but largely composed of well-paid workers, in which the mass assembly that's formed in the capital are now debating whether to start to create an alternative government in the country. Whether they'll be successful in doing that, who knows? But this is an explosive revolutionary situation developing, and it shows that the impetus of the Arab Spring in 2011 hasn't been destroyed by the attempt to drive for a counter-revolution by Saudi Arabia, by the Egyptian state, and so on. But the possibilities are not simply confined to areas of the global south, to Africa, Latin America, and so on. Closer to home, in Europe, you see tremendous movements developing. Most obviously, if you look at France, where you've had the Gilets jaunes movement, which has exploded onto the streets, and is in the process of destroying the government of Macron, this figure who said he could restabilise Europe in the wake of Brexit and Trump and everything else that had happened. And even in Britain, in boring Britain in which nothing happens, as I was flying out of Britain, the streets of London had ground to a halt because thousands upon thousands of protesters had occupied the centre of London in protest against catastrophic climate change. This is a phenomenal movement in Britain, which, sorry, are we letting someone in the room? It's a phenomenal movement. It follows from a series of school students' walkouts, other protests and so on. And to give you a sense of the scale of that movement, already over 1,000 people have been arrested as part of that movement, and yet the movement has grown and continued to occupy central London. This is a phenomenal situation to be in. Alongside these signs of resistance and so on, there's also an extraordinary revival in interest in socialist ideas. And this is a new element of the situation. If you go back 10 or 15 years, we talked about the revival of anti-capitalist ideas. But the idea that these anti-capitalist ideas would have a socialist colouring to them was quite a marginal idea. Today it looks very different. If you look at Britain, the Labour Party is now a mass organisation of 500,000 people, 2 or 3 times bigger than it was just a few years ago, led by Jeremy Corbyn, the most left-wing leader that the Labour Party's ever seen, and the ideas he puts forward are tremendously attractive, particularly to young people. I was in America a few weeks ago. You get exactly the same picture developing there. Yes, you have the horror of Trump and everything Trump represents. At the same time, huge interest in the Democratic Socialists of America, huge interest in whether there'll be a socialist candidate in the presidential election. This is a transformation of the situation. Now, the dangers on the right are equally clear, especially if you're in Austria. I don't need to tell you about the dangers of fascism and the far right and so on. You know more about this than I do. But this is, again, a general phenomenon. Just as in the 1930s, the collapse of mainstream politics is creating opportunities and spaces to the left, but it's also galvanizing a series of radical right forces across Europe. This is true in Britain, it's true in Germany, it's true in France, and it's true in Italy, and it's true in much of Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Hungary, and elsewhere. Now, what is our role in this situation? There's a very, very basic argument I want to put, and I want to begin with this argument. The centre ground of politics is collapsing. Our role as anti-capitalists is not to mourn the passing of the centre ground. It's not to try to restore the centre ground. It's not to try to turn the clock back, but it's to try to radicalise the situation and try to both prevent a breakthrough by the radical right and galvanise the force on the radical left who can begin to shape the future. That has to be the way forward in this situation, not a sort of fake nostalgia for the situation 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And it's this context that informs how we should look at institutions like the European Union, the EU. Now, if you look at the European Union, which has now become, of course, in Britain, the topic of endless debate and discussion. You can't escape from, we didn't talk about the European Union for about 20, 30 years hardly, and now you just can't turn on the television, open a newspaper without hearing about the European Union. It's part of our daily existence now. If you look at the origins of the European Union, you ask, what does this body really represent? At its most basic, the European Union, or the predecessors to the European Union, has its origins in problems faced by capitalism in the post-war period, in the period after 1945. This is a period in which, notably, the United States of America, as the emerging dominant hegemonic power on a global scale, began constructing a new global capitalist order with the support of various capitalist classes in Europe. In other words, it was a period in which new institutions of capitalist rule were being created on a global scale. Now, what these new institutions reflected is the extent to which by 1945, and particularly during the boom that followed the Second World War, the units of capital, the firms making up the capitalist system, had swelled to enormous size to become the forerunners of the multinational corporations that we're all familiar with today. And it posed a particular problem in Europe, because in Europe, even the largest economies, the German, British and French economies, but particularly the smaller economies, but even the largest ones, were too small a terrain, too small a domestic market, too small a basis on which to sustain the truly giant multinationals that could compete on a global scale. And the forerunners to the European Union emerged out of an attempt to solve this dilemma, this puzzle posed to the European ruling classes. What European integration offered, first in coal and steel and then more generally, was a chance to overcome the impoverished scale of the various national markets of Europe, to create a large enough space that these capitalist firms could begin to compete with the largest firms on a global scale. This is really what lies behind the project in its essence. In other words, this is something that has always been a fundamentally capitalist project. We have to start with that fact. Secondly, it was always a project that had a large degree of backing from the US ruling class, something that again is often forgotten in the discussions of the European Union. Donald Trump is really the first American leader who is not a supporter of European integration in some form or other, whatever the tensions between America and the EU. In general, the US ruling class have seen European integration as both creating a market, a valuable market for American multinationals, but also creating a second hegemonic bloc that can help to shape and defend global capitalism. So this is the sort of institution we're talking about. Now, there is nonetheless a huge paradox when you come to left-wing discussions of the European Union. Because if, like me, you see the European Union as something that grew up as an institution of global capitalism, like the International Monetary Fund, like the World Bank, like the WTO, there's no question that you would want to see the destruction of these bodies. And yet, very widely on the left, even in Britain, but I think it's more, probably even more the case in large areas of Europe, the European Union is treated completely differently. It's treated often as a benign institution, reflecting principles of international solidarity, and so on and so forth. Part of the reason for this is the nature of the European project, which goes slightly beyond the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, in terms of the impact it has on people's lives, in terms of how they live their lives and so on, in terms of policing the border regime, in terms of what happens inside the workplace and so on. In order to win support for a pro-capitalist body, such as the European Union, it's necessary to create a degree of consent by the ruling class. In other words, it's been necessary in constructing the European Union to win at least the acquiescence, if not the outright support, of working class people around Europe to a degree. And therefore it's quite important that we understand very, very clearly what this body is that we're being asked to support as working class people. There are two mistakes you can make when you're looking at the European Union as a structure. One is to say that the European Union is a superstate, like Germany or Britain or something like that, but on a bigger scale. It's like the United States of America, it's the United States of Europe. This is a mistake. It's a mistake because if you look at the individual states of Europe, as it becomes very clear every time there's a crisis, whether it's the crisis of 2008, whether it's the sovereign debt crisis in 2010, whether it's the refugee crisis or what have you, whether it's the crisis over Ukraine. Whenever there's a crisis, you find that the individual ruling classes of Europe both have enormous power in their own nation state, but also profoundly disagree, have huge arguments, debates, and so on. At the same time, it's a mistake to see the European Union as simply a gathering of different states from Europe. At the same time, the European Union has created within it its own institutions, its own bureaucracies geared towards defending capitalist interests on a European scale. The most obvious ones, the European Central Bank, a completely unelected institution, and the European Commission. Maybe it's different in Austria, but when we were doing meetings on the European Union in Britain, I'd always ask people, who's the British Commissioner to the European Commission? And I think doing 20 or 30 meetings, not a single person knew the name of the British European Commissioner. Maybe they're slightly better known in continental Europe. But in practice, these are faceless bureaucracies that are completely immune from any kind of democratic control. Another aspect of the creation of this pro-capitalist institution is the creation of the euro. And, again, there's often this very simplistic conception where people think the job of the euro is to make travelling from Austria to France easier. And yeah, it does make travelling from Austria to France easier. That's not the main function of the euro. If you look at what the euro represents, it represents the fact that since this global order was constructed in 1945, the dominant linchpin currency on a global scale, what Marx called world money, the money that really counts in international transactions, has been the dollar. And it's been enormously to the advantage of American multinationals and the American state to have the dollar as the linchpin currency in the global economic system. What the euro represents above all else is an attempt by corporations, banks and governments of Europe to create an alternative form of world money that can compete with the dollar on a global stage. Not entirely successful, by the way, but this is what the project involves. Again, it's a fundamentally capitalist project we're talking about here. And so these institutions penetrate into our lives in Europe, and therefore it has been necessary to create a series of ideological myths and arguments to sustain a degree of support for the European Union. But I think more and more today, that veneer, that ideology surrounding and buttressing the European Union is beginning to come unstuck. There are obvious signs of this. I want to just go through some of the arguments. There are arguments some of you will be familiar with. The first and most obvious argument is the extent to which the European Union has become not just captured by, but one of the key drivers of neoliberal transformation of Europe. In other words, entrenching free market economics, deregulation, privatization, and cuts to public expenditure on a European-wide scale. There is no clearer sign of this than the example of Greece. And I want to talk about Greece for two reasons. First, because it shows the reality of Europe, but secondly, it highlights some of the dangers that the left can, or some of the traps the left can fall into when they're talking about our strategy to resist. If you look at the situation in Greece after 2010, what you had was, of course, the election of a radical left-wing government led by Alexis Tsipras, the Syriza government, elected really for the sole purpose of breaking with the European Union bailout plan and confronting the Troika. The Troika was the organisation, the European Central Bank, the European Commission, and the International Monetary Fund. And incidentally, it's worth noting that within the Troika, it was the International Monetary Fund that was the most moderate of those three bodies. At certain points, the IMF argued for a level of debt relief in Greece. The European Central Bank and European Commission rejected those suggestions. What the Troika imposed on Greece was a level of austerity and social destruction equivalent to that inflicted on Germany in the 1930s or America in the 1930s during the Great Depression. If you look at the statistics about quality of life, of health, of GDP, by almost any measure, it was an absolutely catastrophic social decline that took place in Greece under the auspices of the Troika. Now, this is not simply a question of Germany versus Greece. It's often portrayed like that on the left. That's a mistake. What this actually represents is an array of capitalist interests against working class people in Greece. The Greek sections of the Greek ruling class, the Greek capitalist class, colluded in this project. And it's important to see it in those terms as a class project because it highlights the way that European institutions are imbued with the logic of capitalism, of class division. But there's another part to the story of Greece that's tremendously important, which is what the Syriza government, how the Syriza government responded to this crisis in Greece. And it was a very deep crisis. If people were not around during the summer where the crisis developed in Greece, the sequence of events is very clear. The Tsipras government gets elected, they talk about ending the bailout, the European Commission says no, and then they hold a public referendum and win a vote to end the bailout, to break Greece away from the bailout. The European Central Bank responds by shutting down the supply of money to Greek banks. In other words, there's a powerful process of blackmail going on against the Tsipras government, the Syriza government in Greece. That is to be expected if you're a radical left government elected in times of deep crisis. The question is, what do you do if you're a radical left government in a moment of crisis when the European Central Bank shuts down the money supply? And the logic of the situation was to default unilaterally on the debt, to break with the euro, if necessary to break with the institutions of Europe as a whole, and to begin to implement the kind of anti-austerity measures that will be needed to end the social crisis in Greece. Now the question that always gets asked is, well, you couldn't do that in Greece because the amount of chaos, the disorder in that society would be tremendous. But it leaves out of the equation a really, really important aspect of Greece at this moment of crisis, which is that what you have in Greece is a tremendously powerful, mobilised, collective, workers and students movement on the streets and workplaces of Greece. And the alternative to accepting the blackmail of the European Commission is not some clever rival plan delivered from on high, but it's looking to those organs of workers' struggle to begin to impose a solution on Greek society. I remember I heard Yanis Varoufakis, I spoke at a conference with him in the Czech Republic a few years after the Greek crisis, and he said, you know, when you look at Greece, I think we made mistakes. I had this wonderful plan, and I showed my plan to Alexis Tsipras, and he rejected my plan. The problem is that not a single Greek worker knew about the plan that Yanis Varoufakis has. There's no point having a plan unless you win the working class majority to that plan as an actual process of struggle that can transform the situation. So this is just one example of the nature of the European Union and how we should resist these kind of capitalist forces. There are many others. I'm not going to go through all of them. I could talk about NATO and the expansion into Eastern Europe. I'm not going to go through that because it's very hot in this room and people will get tired very, very quickly. I think one of the other ones that is tremendously important for us to talk about on the left is the nature of the border regime in Europe. Because if you look at the most compelling reason to support European integration, this is the argument which the best people on the left who support the European Union come up with again and again and again, it's freedom of movement, which is actually a right that I would support as a British socialist faced with Brexit. Actually, I don't want to end freedom of movement for European citizens. I want secure rights for those citizens in Britain. But what's always left out of these discussions is that the very process of winning freedom of movement on a European scale involved the construction of a border regime that systematically distinguishes between Europeans and non-Europeans. And this is why, fundamentally, the European Union cannot be a progressive, anti-racist force in world politics. Because systematically, it discriminates between those who are lucky enough to be born European citizens or win European citizenship and those who are not. It systematically distinguishes between me as a British citizen and an Eritrean refugee or a Syrian refugee or someone today fleeing from Algeria or Sudan. And one of the arguments we have to raise about those revolutions is that if there is a crackdown by the regimes, we have to open the gates to those people and allow them into our countries in Europe. Now, this brings me to the final 2 points I want to make really about this discussion. The first is about what's actually happening on this terrain of the European Union. And again, it takes me right back to this argument I made at the beginning, which is to say that we are not the defenders of the centre ground of politics, we are its radical opponents. Because the problem with the argument about buttressing the centre ground is extraordinarily clear in the European context. The European Union has not proved itself to be, and will not prove itself to be, a barrier to radical right-wing forces in Europe. Indeed, on the contrary, radical right-wing forces are incubated in Europe, in part because of the project of austerity and neoliberalism driven through and secured by the European institutions. We cannot rely on the European Union to defend us against these things. The only thing that can be a sure defence against radical right forces is a mobilisation of anti-racists on a left-wing, progressive and radical basis. And these are the kind of movements that I know that Linkswende in Austria, just as the Socialist Workers' Party, my organisation in Britain, are committed to building. Same in Germany, same in many other countries in Europe. Broad radical campaigns that can push back the radical right forces. It's extraordinarily clear in the British case. If you look at the British referendum on the European Union, lots of people argued that the reason we had to vote to remain in the European Union was because otherwise we would end up allying ourselves with radical right-wing forces, because the radical right-wing forces wanted to leave the European Union. This is a mistaken argument, because what it ignores is the way in this context voting against the European Union became symbolic of the rage of millions upon millions of working class people who don't just sometimes hold in their head racist views, but also wanted to kick out against the neoliberal centre-ground establishment in Britain. You have to remember in the referendum in Britain, every single major parliamentary party supported a Remain vote. Every major capitalist corporation, with one or two exceptions, supported a Remain vote. Every bank supported a Remain vote. Every capitalist institution from the Bank of England through to the IMF and so on supported a Remain vote. Barack Obama came to Britain and supported a Remain vote. The Chinese premier came to Britain and supported a Remain vote. And yet, the majority of people voted against it in the face of the establishment. And overwhelmingly, the poorer you were, the less luxurious your lifestyle, the more likely you were to vote to leave the European Union. We do not want to leave that anger, that rage, to be cultivated and nurtured by the radical right. We want to shape it as a radical left. And that's why it's correct to stick to our principles over this question, despite the extraordinarily difficult political context in which movements like Brexit often occur. Now, I want to finish with a final point, which is really about what then, as anti-capitalists, what kind of opposition to the European Union and the centre ground establishments of European politics are we talking about? We don't simply accept that all those who are on the left and oppose the European Union have the correct strategy. I'll give you one obvious example. In Britain, the only other major force on the left, other than my own organisation, who systematically opposed the European Union were the Communist Party of Britain. The problem with the Communist Party's position, and it's also a problem on sections of the left of the Labour Party, is that this opposition of the European Union is combined with elements of nationalism and makes concessions to the anti-migrant arguments that are often mixed up with people's antipathy to the European Union. In other words, if you read their criticisms of the European Union, they accept the argument that European migrants are driving down British wages. This is not just true in Britain. If you look in Germany, if you look at the arguments that Sarah Wagenknecht has put forward in Die Linke organisation, the left party, very, very similar arguments emerging. If you look at the Mélenchon in France, again, a radical left but nationalist project of opposition. I think we have to distance ourselves extremely sharply from this view. Even to the extent that I would rather march against the radical right with a pro-European anti-racist than I would to link arms with people presenting racist arguments. That's been tremendously important in the British context. A few weeks ago, we had on a single day 5 different radical right demonstrations converging in London, called by different organisations. We had thousands of people outside Parliament on a radical right racist basis arguing to leave the European Union. Our position in that was to build a counter-demonstration that involved both people who voted Remain and people who voted Leave, using our organisation Stand Up to Racism, a broad organisation which takes no position on the question of the European Union. It's open to people whatever their position on that question. This is a tremendously important distinction. Yes, we oppose the European Union, but we systematically oppose it on an internationalist basis. We don't give an inch to this argument that EU migrants drive down wages. In fact, I would turn the argument on the head and go back to something that Marx argued very, very clearly, hundreds of years ago. What actually drives down wages is racist division within the working class, is allowing these arguments to take root. The very, very last point really is about what we mean by an anti-capitalist opposition. Because often when we talk about the European Union in Britain, what we say is that part of the reason we have to break with the European Union is that if Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party get elected, they're not hampered from introducing nationalisation, pro-working class reforms and so on. This is absolutely true. If Jeremy Corbyn got elected, it is absolutely clear the European Union will be an obstacle to transforming British society. But it's not enough for us as anti-capitalists to say our goal is the election of a Jeremy Corbyn government. Just a moment's thought will make absolutely clear to you that however nasty and unpleasant the European Union are, the British ruling class could teach the European Union a thing or two about attacking working class people and destroying left-wing governments. It is not true that you simply remove the European Union and then ride to victory on the coattails of a left-wing Labour Party or Social Democratic leader. This is made very clear a few weeks ago. There were two things happened which made it absolutely clear. The first is there was an article in the Financial Times that talked about the corporations preparing for a Corbyn government. And what it says, if you actually read between the lines, is that they will take their money out of the country. They will use every mechanism of economic sabotage to break any radical left government that comes to power, just as they did in Greece. The second thing that made this absolutely clear was a story emerged from within the army in Britain that on a firing range where people were practicing their shooting, the target was a photograph of Jeremy Corbyn. There are people within the state who would be bitterly hostile to an incoming Corbyn government. And at both levels, we cannot simply stay at the level of being cheerleaders for a left reformist government. We have to talk about, if we get that kind of government, which we want in Britain and will campaign for in Britain, if we get that, what would we have to do to defend that government? In order to defend that government, we have to unleash a power capable of confronting the power of capital and the power of the British state. And that means looking to collective forces in the working class of the kind that we're seeing on the streets of Algeria and Sudan and in the Gilets jaunes movement at the moment. We have to talk about unlocking powerful working class forces. And if you start to unlock those powerful working class forces, why would we stop at the point of getting a left-wing government? And why wouldn't we go the next step forwards and start raising arguments for fundamental social transformation and a genuine anti-capitalist project that breaks with the logic of the system as a whole? I'll finish that. Yeah, first of all, someone asked the question, how successful was Lexit in channeling the anti-establishment move to the left? Honestly, not very successful. And I say this as one of the people who helped run the campaign. It was tremendously difficult. And you shouldn't think that we were all sitting in our homes thinking what we really want now is a referendum in Britain over the European Union. It was a nightmare for us. It's not what we wanted to be doing. You know, it was tremendously divisive inside the left, in which I would say the sort of revolutionary left, the Socialist Workers' Party, has a minority position and a small minority. But it's divisive inside the working class. You know, particularly in areas like London, large numbers of working class people voted Remain. And the moment you say you voted Leave, they immediately think you're a racist, that you're with Nigel Farage, that you're some sort of horrible right-wing figure. And of course, you can win people and persuade them, but it takes time to do that. You have to have long conversations to explain our position. And the problem with the Lexit campaign, I think it was the right thing to do, but it was too politically isolated. And critical to this was when Jeremy Corbyn decided he was going to campaign for a Remain position. Jeremy Corbyn privately has a left-wing critical position towards the European Union. Like a lot of the older generation of Labour leaders, but publicly he campaigned for Remain, although he didn't campaign particularly hard for Remain, and he got attacked from both sides, therefore, as a result of that. So we were quite isolated in those arguments. It was quite a difficult campaign. Nonetheless, it's the right thing to do to try to campaign around your principles, and we did it as best we could. I should say, during the referendum campaign, our main activity wasn't around the referendum. Our main activity was bringing support to the refugee camp in Calais. And that was tremendously important, because the moment anyone on the left said we were racist, we could say, but no, we're the people driving this big anti-racist project, and we're working with Remain and Leave people. And we've always put that argument very, very hard. Secondly, someone said something about how people start from reformist politics and then they project this reformist politics onto the European Union. I think that's right. But in a sense, it's silly that they do that, because the European Union is not an object of reform in the way that a normal capitalist state is. And this is part of the weirdness of the European Union. If it were true that the European Union was a pan-European state, and we had a single European working class and a single European capitalist class, of course, one of the key things we'd do is we'd organise to put pressure on the European state for reforms. That's what we do as revolutionaries a lot of the time, is we pressure our state to give us reforms as a way of building up working class forces and militancy and so on. The point is, it's ridiculous to try and do that over most questions in Europe, because the dynamic of the class struggle, although there are patterns across Europe, the dynamic of class struggle tends to take on a national terrain, and there are various national governments you have to try to extract reforms from. And so our main orientation is to try to wrest reforms from our national states. The European institutions are practically unreformable. The big pan-European institutions are not democratically elected, with the exception of the European Parliament, which can't really decide anything. If you actually wanted to fundamentally transform the European Union, you have to win the argument at once in 28 different countries by getting a radical left government elected, at which point the European Union becomes pointless, because we can construct our own forms of internationalism from below. So the whole argument, which you get from Yanis Varoufakis and people like that we should stay in the European Union and reform it, is a nonsensical argument that transposes a perfectly valid argument at the national level onto these institutions where it doesn't really make any sense. Thirdly, I want to talk mainly about racism and the right. It's absolutely true, people talked about the border regime around Europe, and I think it's important to state this border regime is not just on the edge of Europe. This is a border regime that extends into Eastern Europe, into Turkey, and into North Africa. And you can go to North Africa, there are refugee camps built there with European money where people are routinely tortured, raped, murdered at the hands of security guards in Libya and in other countries in the region. It's a barbaric border regime directed towards blocking people entering Europe. This is one of the reasons why many radical right forces, once they actually get to power, or share power in Europe, find ways of accommodating the European Union. In opposition, the radical right is rhetorically often very, very opposed to the European Union. It's much more moderate in its approach to the European Union, often when it reaches power. That's true in large areas of Eastern Europe, in which it's unthinkable in capitalist terms to break with the European Union. It's seen as so intrinsic to the project of capitalism in that country. So there are often quite contradictory positions taken towards the European Union. Nonetheless, rhetorically, it's an important argument for the radical right. Now, you're worried about the European Union elections in Austria. Imagine what the European Union elections are going to be like in Britain. We're being asked to elect people to the European Parliament on behalf of a country that's not even going to be in Europe in a few months' time. Who's going to turn out for those elections? The only people who are actually going to turn out are the people who tend to support the most rabid, racist, nationalistic forces who think that actually we should break from the European Union straight away with no deal, and feel that even the talks that are going on are a betrayal. In other words, there's a real danger in Britain that the forces who capitalise on those elections are the radical right political parties. Now, it's also very important to say that what we're seeing in these elections is a very important reorganisation of the radical right across Europe. This is also true in Britain. If you look at the right in Britain, since the British National Party collapsed, there hasn't been a party that has contained fascists within it that has had any real electoral base in Britain. The British National Party was a fascist party, modelled largely on the Front National in France in recent years, essentially a combination of our agitation as anti-fascists and the tensions within that organisation as it tried to move between electoral work and street agitation broke the British National Party many, many years ago. And it's very important to say that the opposition from anti-racist was crucial to making sure that that party wouldn't make a breakthrough. I remember not very long ago, the British National Party had 50-something councillors. They had, I think, 2 people in the European Parliament. They had people in the London Assembly and so on. Today, the British National Party barely exists as an organisation. Since their collapse, there hasn't been a party of that kind in Britain. There hasn't been the equivalent of the FPO or the AfD in Germany as a sort of hybrid party. These parties haven't existed. What we had in Britain were a series of street movements, largely led by Tommy Robinson, the most prominent fascist now in Britain. And we had a sort of right-wing but non-fascist movement called UK Independence Party, UKIP, led by Nigel Farage. And UKIP were very careful that when a fascist joined UKIP, they would be expelled. In other words, they didn't want to allow themselves to be presented as Nazis or fascists, and they weren't. That wasn't the logic of what they were doing. What we've seen since the referendum is a regroupment of the radical right in Britain, in which UKIP's support has collapsed. And now, in an attempt to regroup, UKIP have turned to Tommy Robinson. And they announced today that Robinson is going to be one of their candidates in the European election. In other words, they're now allowing Nazis and fascists to play a leading role in the UK Independence Party. And that's a danger in the European elections for us, that suddenly you have this party which is a hybrid between right-wing conservatives and nationalists and genuine fascist forces that has some prominence in the political debate and landscapes in Britain. And one of the challenges for us is what we're going to do about that. And we'll clearly have to mount a serious campaign to try to stop them using the European Parliament and the British seats there as a platform to build their politics. A couple of people talked about generation identity or the identitarian movement. We have the same thing in Britain. I think this is a very important development because what these identitarian movements are doing is they're giving an ideological clarity to those broader radicalising right-wing movements. Also, very importantly, something we haven't faced in Britain for decades, they're building in universities. They're actually pulling young people around them. The fascist movement has largely, not always, but often been seen as a movement of old white guys, old white men, really. This is allowing them to begin to recruit a younger layer of people. And so this is a very, very dangerous movement and one that we have to very seriously confront. 2 final points to finish. First is someone mentioned, you can't just create a radical left movement out of thin air. I think that's absolutely true. We have the same problem in Britain. There's a powerful anti-racist movement that we've constructed. Actually, the radical left element is too weak. Given the scale of the political crisis in Britain, given that the government has suffered the worst defeat that any government in British history has ever suffered in Parliament, given that everyone knows Theresa May, our Prime Minister, is going in a matter of weeks, given that she no longer has support of her own party, and large sections of her base are not going to vote for the Conservative Party in the European elections, it is phenomenal that she's able to limp on, to carry on in power in the way that she does. And part of our argument is to say, actually, if Jeremy Corbyn said, all my supporters must go on the street, if the trade union said everyone must get onto the streets, if the radical left movement as a whole said everyone must get onto the streets, we could topple Theresa May in a day, I believe, in Britain. That's a reality. And sometimes all you can do as an anti-capitalist, as a revolutionary, is say what should happen and try to win as many people as possible to that position in the hope that broader movements will emerge. You see this all the time. The Extinction Rebellion movement that's been protesting in London, I'm not saying it came from nowhere, there have been earlier protests by this group, but it's an explosive movement. These movements do develop, and suddenly you find you have an audience to put these kind of arguments. So even if the audience is limited, we have to say what the way forward is. And finally, very, very last point. what we do around this stuff really, really matters. I go back to the history of the Anti-Nazi League, the first serious anti-fascist organisation that we founded in Britain in the 1970s. Two things. First of all, one of the sort of leading figures in the black movement, Dark as Hell, he always tells a story where he says, the first of my children in the 1970s grew up scared and black. But the next kid grew up proud and black. And they grew up proud and black because of the Anti-Nazi League. Because very, very small revolutionary forces, working with the broader anti-racist movement, winning over sections of the Labour Party and the trade union movement, making serious inroads into the working class, managed to shift the whole debate around race in British society. We managed to do that. I'll give you another example. A friend of mine called Pete, who's an SWP member today, for a very poor working class family in Lewisham. He posted something on Facebook the other day, a little story he wrote. And he said that when I was a kid, I lived in Lewisham. There was a huge battle there between the National Front, the fascist organisation, and anti-fascists. And he says when he was young, he was a racist, he had lots of bigoted ideas, and he wanted to go to a National Front meeting and talk about joining the National Front. And he said, actually, my mum and dad told me I wasn't allowed to go because if I went to that meeting, there'd be a fight with the anti-fascists, the anti-Nazi League would be there, I wouldn't get into the meeting, I'd get beaten up, or something like that. In a small way, those kind of movements, they do have an impact. It makes a difference whether someone is there to confront fascist forces when they start to mobilise and when they start to crystallise. And so the work that you're doing, I know that you've been attacked by people for your characterisation of the FPO. I think you're absolutely right in how you characterise the FPO. But the work that you're doing in exposing them as fascists, in saying that they're fascists, labelling them as fascists, confronting them, is absolutely crucial to the whole future of the left and the anti-racist forces in this country. And you should be very proud of the work you're doing. I'll finish there.